This story is going to sound crazy, but every word is true. My wife and I have been married for 8 years. No kids yet, but maybe someday. I work in IT and Samantha's a teacher. Not the type to make up stories or see things that aren't there. We'd been saving up for years to buy a piece of land to build our dream house. Finally found this perfect spot in Northern California, right in the heart of the redwoods. Beautiful, secluded, just the kind of place we wanted. It's near this little town called Oric, not far from the coast. You've probably never heard of it. Anyway, we head out there one weekend to check out the land, map out where we're gonna build, that kind of stuff. It's a gorgeous day, I remember as well. We're walking through the woods, talking about where we'll put the kitchen, how big the deck should be, that sort of thing. And then, out of nowhere, we hear this weird noise. It's this deep, low sound, kind of like a moan, but not exactly. I look at Samantha and she's got this puzzled look on her face. We stop walking and just listen. There it is again, that sound. Only now it's closer. We're standing there trying to figure out what it could be. We're not exactly experts on wildlife, so we're just guessing. Now, the trees in this part of the woods are super thick, so you can't see very far ahead. We're squinting, trying to see if there's anything moving between the trees. That's when we see it. This huge figure, standing maybe 30 yards away from us. It's covered in hair, dark brown, almost black. It's standing on 2 legs, like a person, but it's no person. It's easily over 7 feet tall. Samantha grabs my arm, tight. Neither of us can believe what we're seeing. It's just standing there, looking at us. I remember thinking it's got to be a person that we are mistaking for a creature. But deep down, I know it's not. The way it's standing, the size of it, it's too real. The creature, or whatever it is, doesn't move. Just stands there looking the other way, but turning its head slowly. It finally turns enough that it sees us, but nothing at all happens. And then, as if it decides we're not a threat, or maybe not interesting, it turns and walks away. Just like that. It moves gently. In one moment it's there, the next it's gone, blending into the trees. Samantha and I are still standing there, not moving, not speaking. Finally, she looks at me and asks if I saw it clearly. I just nod. We're both shaken up. In my mind, I'm thinking, was it a Sasquatch? It couldn't be, right? But what else could it be? We decide we've had enough exploring for one day. As we make our way back to the car, the silence between us is heavy. It's like neither of us wants to be the first to say what we're thinking. We get into the car, and I start the engine, but neither of us is in a hurry to leave. We just sit there, staring out at the forest. Finally, Samantha breaks the silence. "That was a Sasquatch, wasn't it?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. I can only nod. What else could it be? Sure, I've heard stories, seen those TV shows, but I never really believed. Not until now. We start talking then, trying to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was something else, but we both know it's not true. Normal animals don't walk like that, don't look like that. This was something else, something neither of us has ever seen before. The drive back to our place is quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. Every now and then, one of us would start to say something, then stop. What can you say after seeing something like that? When we get home, we go straight to the internet. We spend hours looking up Sasquatch sightings, trying to find anything that sounds like what we saw. There are a lot of stories, some of them not far from where we were. It's a bit comforting, I guess, knowing we're not the only ones who've seen something. But the more we read, the more unsettled we become. There are so many stories, so many sightings, and yet it's all treated like a big joke. How can so many people see something, and still, it's not taken seriously? We talk about going back, maybe trying to see it again. The next few days are weird. We try to go about our lives, but it's like there's this cloud hanging over us. We're distracted, jumpy. Every little noise makes us jump. It's like we're waiting for the other to suggest going back. And we're not really talking to anyone else about it. But it's hard, keeping something like that a secret. It feels like it's always there, just under the surface, waiting to come out. And I keep thinking about that land, our dream home. Can we still build it there, knowing what's out in those woods? Samantha and I had long conversations every night, going over every detail. We even started having dreams about it, or at least I did. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, feeling like it was standing right outside our window, or worse yet, next to our bed. A few weeks go by and we're still on edge, but life has to go on, right? We've got this piece of land, and we've got plans. We can't just abandon everything because of one weird encounter. So we decide to go back. I know it sounds crazy, but we had to see it again. We drive up there again, this time with a bit more caution. We tell ourselves we're just going to look at the land, make some plans, nothing more. But I think both of us are hoping, maybe even expecting, to see it again. We get there, and everything looks the same, peaceful and quiet. We start walking around, pointing out where we'd put this and that. But it's different. We're constantly looking over our shoulders, listening for any sound out of the ordinary. Hours pass, and there's no sign of anything, nothing to suggest it was ever even there. I'm not sure if I'm relieved or disappointed. It's confusing, feeling both at the same time. We're about to head back when Samantha grabs my arm. She's staring at something in the trees. I look, and there it is, the Sasquatch, standing just at the edge of the woods, watching us. It's farther away this time, but it's definitely the same creature. This time I can see it more clearly. It's tall, incredibly tall, with arms that hang down past its knees. Its face is partly covered in hair, but I can see its eyes. Then, just like last time, it turns and walks away, disappearing into the forest. We don't say much on the drive back. We saw it again, and we're both thinking about it. It's real as anything. And now we have to decide what to do about our land, our dream. Do we build there, knowing what's out in those woods, or do we give up on it? That's where we're at now, stuck in this limbo. We haven't made a decision yet. It's hard, knowing there's something out there, something unknown and wild. And that's the story, as crazy as it sounds. A real-life Sasquatch encounter, not once but twice. Makes you wonder what else is out there, doesn't it? I'm not what you'd call a typical guy. And with that, I don't have a typical job. My job? I'm an antique restorer, specializing in old mechanical devices. Think clocks, music boxes, that sort of thing. It's a niche skill, but I've always been fascinated by the intricacies of mechanisms that have stood the test of time. This job takes me to all sorts of places, usually old homes or estates where forgotten treasures lie, gathering dust in attics and basements. This story takes place in late September, on a vast property in rural Montana. I was there because the owner, an elderly gentleman who had recently passed away, had an extensive collection of antique clocks. His family wanted them appraised and restored where necessary before they were auctioned off. The estate was a sprawling piece of land, with dense woods bordering it and a few dilapidated structures scattered around. One of these was an old barn, standing lopsidedly in a field. Its wood was gray and weathered from years of harsh winters. I arrived late in the afternoon. The plan was to stay overnight in the main house, start work early in the morning. My truck, loaded with tools and equipment, rumbled along the gravel path leading to the barn. I figured I'd check out the barn first. These places sometimes hide the most unexpected antiques. Something about that barn felt weird to me, weirder than other barns I've rummaged through. Not in a haunted house movie kind of way, but there was a tangible sense of strangeness. As I neared the barn, a soft scraping noise came from within. The rational part of me thought it was just animals inside who had taken over, but the rest of me wasn't convinced, based mostly on the sound. I hesitated, then pushed the creaking barn doors open. The light coming through the broken wood made everything look a bit distorted, and at first it was hard to make anything out. But then, as my eyes adjusted, the sight that greeted me was something out of a dark fantasy. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn, I saw it. A creature, impossibly tall and thin, with skin like pale, dead leaves. It was hunched over, almost as if it was in pain, and its arms were unnaturally long. fingers ending in sharp, talon-like nails. But it was the creature's eyes that held me, a piercing, glowing yellow, glowing in the dim light. I knew instantly that I was looking at a crawler, something I'd heard in passing tales, but never believed to be real. Yet here it was. The creature didn't move towards me, and I slowly began to back away, not wanting to provoke it. Its gaze followed me, but it remained still. These creatures were the stuff of local legends. They were said to inhabit remote, forgotten places, lurking in the shadows, always just out of sight. The crawler's presence was overwhelming. Despite its frightening appearance, it didn't seem aggressive. It just stood there, observing me with an intense curiosity that felt almost human. Its head tilted slightly, as if trying to decipher what I was, much like I was trying to understand it. Its skin, a ghastly pale, stretched tightly over its bony frame. The ribs were visible under the skin, each breath it took causing them to rise and fall slowly. The arms, unnaturally long, hung by its sides, ending in elongated fingers that scraped the ground. But those eyes, those unblinking, glowing yellow eyes, held an intelligence that contradicted its monstrous form. I couldn't move, not just out of fear, but out of a strange sense of awe. Here was a creature that defied all logic, a being that shouldn't exist, yet it stood mere feet from me. Its gaze never left mine. Then, breaking the silence, the crawler emitted a low, rasping sound. It wasn't a growl, but something more complex, almost like a form of communication. I obviously didn't understand it, but the sound sent shivers down my spine. Then the air in the barn grew colder, or maybe it was just my nerves. I realized then that I had to put distance between myself and this creature. As I stepped back, the crawler mimicked my movement, retreating further into the shadows of the barn. I backed out of the barn, never turning my back on the creature. As the daylight faded outside, the crawler's figure became a part of the shadows, indistinguishable from the darkness. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless thoughts. But that next morning, I found myself drawn back to the barn. A part of me needed to see the crawler again. As I approached the barn, the morning light revealed more of its dilapidated state. The wood creaked with each step I took. I half expected the crawler to be there, waiting for me, but the barn was empty, save for the lingering sense of its presence. I spent the day working in the main house, cataloging and examining the antique clocks. Yet, my mind kept drifting back to the barn. As evening approached, I decided to take one last walk around the property. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The air had a chill to it. Or again, maybe it was my nerves. I found myself standing at the edge of the woods, looking into the dense thicket of trees. It was then I heard it again, the same low, rasping sound I had heard from the crawler. It was coming from the woods now. Without really thinking, I followed the sound, my feet carrying me deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, the canopy above blocking out the remaining light. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and then there it was, standing at the edge of a clearing. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, and it watched me approach. This time, there was a sense of recognition, as if it remembered me from the barn. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to do next. The crawler tilted its head, studying me. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, closing the distance between us. My heart raced, but I didn't move. It stopped right in front of me, its towering form looming over me. For a long moment, we just stood there, human and cryptid, facing each other. Then, with a movement that was almost gentle, the crawler reached out with one of its long arms. I flinched instinctively, but it merely touched my shoulder, its fingers surprisingly warm against my skin. In that touch, I felt a rush of emotions: curiosity, loneliness, a deep, unspoken understanding. The moment was brief. The crawler withdrew its hand and stepped back, melting into the shadows of the forest. I was left standing there alone. As I walked back to the house, I knew that this experience would change me forever. I had come to this property as an antique restorer, but I was leaving with a story that was more extraordinary than any object I had ever worked on. The crawler, a creature of myth and legend, was now a part of my life's experiences. A couple of years ago, I took a trip to Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota. I went out there because my grandfather had grown up in Minnesota and always talked about the Boundary Waters. It was the 1-year anniversary of his passing, and I wanted to head there to honor him and see the area with my own eyes. It was smack in the middle of summer. The sun felt nice and not too hot, and the blueberry bushes were packed with ripe berries. So I was just standing there at one point, picking and eating some berries. You know, as you pick the ripe blueberries, their juice stains your fingers and it smells fresh and natural. It's such a simple activity, but it's pretty satisfying if you're the type who enjoys nature. You kind of lose track of time when you're out in the woods like that. There I was in this endless forest, surrounded by big old trees, picking blueberries when something suddenly stopped me. I remember the moment exactly. I was looking at a bush full of ripe berries, hidden under broad leaves. You could hear the sound of crickets in the background. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. It was a deep growl that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It totally caught me off guard. Even the usual sounds of the crickets seemed to quiet down with the noise. I would say you could have cut the tension with a knife. I was looking around, trying to figure out where that noise was coming from. It's weird how your mind plays tricks on you when you think you're in danger. Every little noise and shadow starts feeling suspicious. There was also this really bad stench in the air. The horrible smell really freaked me out. It made me feel like something bad had happened, or was about to happen. It was like my gut telling me to be careful because something dangerous was close. I then saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye. That's when it hit me. I wasn't the only one in the forest. Something big then jumped out of the bushes at me, and everything got really quiet. Everything was so still, it felt like even the wind stopped. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Right there, under the tall pine trees, was this massive creature, slightly bent as if its massive torso was too much for its strong muscles. In the sunlight, it looked more like a beast than anything I'd ever seen, with a huge chest, strong arms with long, deadly claws and wide shoulders. It had a thick fur coat that was a mix of gray and brown. Basically, the thing looked like a mix of a man and a dog. Normally, I'd find that funny, like something you'd see in a comic book. But this wasn't funny. It scared the heck out of me. I was totally freaked out when we locked eyes. They were yellow and beamed like they knew it was at the top of the food chain. It really scared me to my core. By now, it started growling and grunting, making the air around feel heavy with a bad vibe. I was sure it was threatening me. Its long snout moved and wrinkled, showing off a solid jaw and a mouth that was drooling. I didn't waste any time and I took off running. I thought I was quick to begin with, but being scared made me run faster than I thought I could, and I didn't even notice the branches hitting my face and arms. I dashed into the thick forest, hoping it would hide me from the animal that I was sure was stalking me. I finally reached my car and struggled with the keys because I was so panicked. I was expecting to feel its claws on my back at any moment, but it never happened. I hopped in the car, started it, and drove off really fast, leaving a bunch of dust behind and cranking up the radio to cover up my heavy breathing. After that, I couldn't look at the woods the same way. Every little shadow scared me. Every sound from the leaves freaked me out. Did I stumble upon something in the woods that I shouldn't have? It took me a bit to remember where I'd heard of such creatures before. Old myths and stories from loggers, campers, and hikers, stuff most people just wrote off as campfire tales, suddenly seemed real. I also remember what they called the thing I saw. They called it a dogman. My wife and I were in Big Bend National Park in Texas last year, at the end of April. We decided to take a trip down there to see if we could spot any of the unusual creatures that have been reported there over the years. I had read about the Marfa lights, also known as the Marfa ghost lights, and thought it would be interesting to investigate some of these strange phenomena that have been reported for many years. I was stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas in El Paso, back in 1969 to 1970 and remembered hearing stories about these lights. It seemed like every time someone mentioned them, they also talked about being chased by something out in those hills. As far as my knowledge on this subject is concerned, I don't think anyone has ever really explained what causes these lights, or who or what is chasing people around out there. There seems to be a lot of folklore connected with both phenomena. We left our home near Tucson on Monday and drove half of the 9+ hour trip, and we arrived at Big Bend early Tuesday afternoon. We checked into one of the cabins within the park boundaries, then went up into Terlingua, a small town just a bit northeast. Then drove a bit further to La Kiva Bar and Restaurant to grab a bite to eat before heading back into our cabin for an early evening sleep. The next day, we started hiking around after breakfast until mid-afternoon when it got too hot. Texas at this time was already 90 degrees. As nightfall approached, my wife wanted us to head up north from Panther Junction towards Persimmon Gap, where she heard reports that people often saw shadowy figures running alongside their vehicles. She thought it may have something to do with skinwalkers, which she read quite a bit about while living in Arizona, but it was getting too late, so we gave up on that idea. I asked one of the rangers about any sightings or reports concerning Bigfoot in the area. He told me that there have been many stories over the years, but nothing substantial except for tracks found here and there. I thought this was interesting information. The only problem they had was trying to determine what made those impressions on the ground. They weren't deep enough to make out details, but they seemed odd. We got back to our cabin around 9 p.m., opened up all windows, then went outside onto the porch area with binoculars and my camera mounted on a tripod. We waited until close to midnight when it started getting really dark. You know how bright it can get in Big Bend. It's bright because of all those stars. As we looked across towards Mexico from where we were sitting, I noticed an orange light coming from below us, just beyond Lajitas. She quickly ran inside, grabbed her phone, and then called her friend Lucy. After hanging up, she explained that Lucy's husband witnessed something similar several years ago near Study Butte while he was driving home late at night. He told her about these two lights chasing him down the highway before suddenly disappearing as he crossed into Presidio County. Anyway, at this point we were both tired and nothing concrete had happened, so we headed back inside the cabin to hit the hay. So the next day, we decided to return to the park. My wife seemed a bit disappointed. She had hoped for a close encounter with the unknown, something more than just lights in the distance, and hearing about strange tracks. We walked around a bit, but still no sightings. That evening, we decided to give it one last try. We picked a spot near the Rio Grande, where it was quiet and secluded. As darkness enveloped the landscape, we sat there, just watching and waiting. Hours passed. Crickets chirped in the background, and the occasional howl of a distant coyote pierced the night. But the mysterious lights didn't appear. Instead, the air around us began to change, and the temperature dropped. We were about to call it a night when my wife nudged me. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the river. There, in the dim light cast by our camp lantern, we could see something moving across the Rio Grande. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a figure, but not human. It moved with an odd, fluid grace that was mesmerizing. I lifted the binoculars to my eyes, trying to get a better look. The figure was tall, and even at this distance I could tell it was covered in what seemed like fur. Or maybe it was just the shadows. It stopped mid-river, and it felt like it was looking right at us. My heart was racing, but I couldn't look away. "Do you see that?" I asked my wife, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer, just nodded, her eyes fixed on the figure. We watched as it reached the other side of the river and disappeared into the thick brush. We sat there for what felt like hours, neither of us willing to move or speak. Finally, I reached over and gently took her hand. "Let's go back to the cabin," I said. We packed up our things quietly and made our way back. When we got back to the cabin, we locked the door and sat on the couch, listening to the silence of the night, both excited and a bit scared of what we had seen. The next morning, we were quiet as we packed up the car to head home. The drive back was uneventful, but the image of that figure in the river stayed with me. I kept going over it in my mind. It wasn't until we were almost home that my wife finally broke the silence. "What do you think that was?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know," I replied. "But it sure was something unbelievable, wasn't it?" She nodded. "Yeah, it was something." We haven't been back to Big Bend since then. But sometimes, when we're sitting outside on a clear night, I find myself looking up at the stars and thinking about it. The not knowing can be frustrating, but it's also thrilling, and that's okay. Sometimes, it's about the wonder and the thrill of the unknown. And that night, at the edge of the Rio Grande, we got to do that. So, that's our story. It's not full of dramatic revelations or answers to age-old questions. But it's our experience, a shared moment that we'll never forget. And maybe, just maybe, that's more important than any answer we could have found.